Welcome to the Mentors Moguls podcast. I'm your host, Heather Stone. I bring you mentors and moguls from all around the world, different walks of life, from creatives to CEOs to business leaders to top athletes and all kinds of other people in between. If you like our episode today, all of our podcasts are available on our YouTube channel. Please go ahead and subscribe and comment. We'd love to hear your feedback. We're here today in Harlem with Elinor Tatum. She is the publisher and editor-in-chief for New York Amsterdam News. Thank you and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You've got a fascinating story, so I'm so excited to share this with the viewers today. So tell us a little bit about your journey. Tell us a little bit about your passion, first of all, and how did you discover your passion for news, for writing, and at what age did you discover that?
Well, gosh, that's a pretty broad question.
It is.
It's actually a pretty broad answer as well. And it comes from a lot of different places and a lot of different times in my life. I started writing at a very young age. I used to tell my parents stories and they used to write them down for me because as a child, I actually didn't learn to read or write till I was actually quite old for what you would consider the appropriate age to learn how to read and write, because I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was in the first grade. So at first grade, I could barely read a sentence. I could barely read, words that most people would think a child should be able to read in kindergarten.
Right.
And the only reason I was actually found out to have dyslexia is because I was in a school for gifted children. And my teacher said to my parents, well, I know your daughter's smart, but there's definitely something wrong here because she can't read.
Did you have an idea at that particular point that something was different when it came to your reading? Or did you think you were just struggling? Or did you not even notice a difference at all?
I really can't remember.
Okay, so that's great. That's great.
At that point, I really can't remember what happened.
Okay.
Maybe it's something I blocked out because it was too traumatic. I do remember that because of it, I really didn't get a second grade education because I was put in a class that had 2 second graders and the rest were first graders.
Okay.
But I do remember that my parents did everything that they could to make sure that I got the help that I needed so that I could continue to be educated. I had tutors. I went to a place called the Orton Society, which was a place that learned very early on that people with dyslexia just learned differently.
Right.
And I ended up progressing very well, as you can see, because I now am an editor. My spelling still is absolutely abysmal.
Right. It's okay.
But that's why we have computers.
Yes.
But, through all of that, I continued to write. And it's very interesting today to watch my daughter. I have an 8-year-old. And the way they teach writing now is so different than when I was a child because they don't really look at spelling right now. And, she's in the second grade. And they just want them to write. And they look at spelling later.
Oh.
And so as long as I can figure out what they're trying to say, that's the whole idea, because they don't want to stunt their writing and their ideas flowing by them worrying about how the words are spelled.
Oh, that's fascinating. Why wasn't that around when we were younger?
Exactly.
Wow.
And so what I see her doing is getting these words on the page.
Yes.
And they're not spelled right, but I know what the ideas are.
Right.
And I see these ideas and this imagination flourishing, and I see a happiness in the work that she's doing. And I know that when I was a child, that wasn't happening for so many kids that had dyslexia.
Right.
And other learning disabilities, because there was so much pressure on them to get every word right. Right. And every letter in the right place. And seeing a saw as a was, it was something that was just so frowned upon. But, I had many teachers that didn't understand what dyslexia was. And I had other teachers that thought that somebody that had a learning disability was somebody that was stupid. And, well, as you can see, I proved most of them wrong.
Yes, you did.
And then some.
Yes.
Yes.
But so that was, the first part of my journey to what I'm doing today, which is writing and editing. But, when I went to college, first day at college, my father walked me right into the school newspaper, the college newspaper, and said, "You'll be spending some time here." And I immediately started working for the college newspaper. It was called the Hill News. Mm-hmm. And I worked there for the whole 4 years that I was at college. And then I went off to Stockholm, Sweden to study international relations. And then during that summer that I was there, my father, who was the publisher at the time of the Amsterdam News, came to see me and basically said, it's now or never.
Time to step up.
And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "It's time." And I said, "But Dad, you said you really wanted me to go out and do my own thing for a while." And he said, "Well, you have. It's now or never."
How'd that make you feel?
Well, I was kind of shocked.
Right.
Because when he had first told me he wanted me to go out and do my own thing first.
Right.
I had been shocked at that point because I'd been thinking always I was going to go straight to the paper.
Okay.
So that was an adjustment in and of itself.
Right.
And then he said, "Okay, now you're coming to the paper now." And I was like, wait, I had just recalibrated to go out and figure out what I was going to go do.
Right.
And now you're telling me it's now that I'm supposed to be coming to the paper.
Right.
So that was an adjustment.
Little pivot.
Yeah, another pivot.
Yeah.
And so I came back to New York.
Mm-hmm.
And I started working for the paper. And within 6 months, my father had a massive heart episode and had to have a quadruple bypass.
Oh, my goodness.
So I was thrown in head first, trial by fire.
Wow. Wow. Was that okay? So we need to stop there. So what was that like in your head when you came back? You just got adjusted, 6 months. You had a family tragedy to a rock. I know you and your dad were very close.
Yeah. Well,
and
he was luckily fine.
Okay, so that's terrific.
Right.
But you still did you feel the overwhelming weight to carry on with him, without him? Did that change the way you looked at your new responsibility?
Well, it showed me that he knew something.
Right, right.
Without knowing something.
Mm-hmm.
And his now or never was, "Come on, I need you."
Right.
And it was, "Be here now so that I can show you the ropes."
Mm-hmm.
And I was really lucky because there's so many families, especially in the African American community, who don't have that opportunity to have a father or mother show their child the ropes.
Right.
Before they have to pass down a legacy institution.
Exactly.
Or they don't have a child that is interested in taking on a legacy institution. He had the quadruple bypass, and luckily he came through it, very well. And now that was in, I believe, 1995. Mm-hmm. And, a few years later, when I started working at the paper, I was doing things like getting coffee and getting lunch and sending out faxes and rewriting press releases. And at that point, we really didn't even have many computers. I insisted when I came to the office that I have a computer because none of the other people in the editorial department had computers at that point in time. Very soon after that, everyone had a computer, and they went kicking and screaming to computers, let me tell you.
Really?
They all had typewriters still. Yeah.
Well, you were progressive at that time, so good for you.
And so a few years later, my father had an accident in which the chair he was sitting on in a restaurant broke, and he hit the back of his neck on a table. Mm. And when he went to have surgery to correct it, it went wrong, and he ended up in a wheelchair for the last 10 years of his life.
Oh.
So he was an incomplete quadriplegic.
All right. So how did that change your world?
Well, he could no longer come to the office because we are 4 flights of stairs here in the office.
Right.
And that was around 1990, 99 that happened. And I had just been made publisher and editor-in-chief before that.
Another intuitive move.
Yeah.
All right. So did that make you feel even a stronger sense of responsibility?
But luckily, he was just a phone call away.
Okay. So that's terrific.
Yeah. And so he was still, very much a part of the business.
Okay.
And so I had another 10 years with him as a very, very close advisor. And he was still chairman, and he was still there. And we had him for another 10 years. And then he died in February of 2009. So I was very lucky. I did have him as a close advisor, and I worked with him for, from 1994 to 2009.
You were lucky.
I was very lucky.
You were very lucky.
And, my parents both were, and my mother still is, very, very strong people. They met on a political campaign in the 1960s.
Yes. Tell us more about that. I love your background. I think it's so important to.
Well, it's actually kind of funny and kind of ironic in some ways as well. They met on a campaign for Ed Koch, who was then running for, I think it was district leader. And at that point in time, he was a young upstart, very idealistic. And my parents were both part of the Village Independent Democrats. Now, why that's so funny is because my father and Ed Koch became basically arch enemies later on.
Okay.
And absolutely hated each other.
Okay.
But I wouldn't be around if it wasn't for him, because they met on his campaign and worked tirelessly for Ed Koch. And it's actually very funny because just the other day I was going through some of my father's archival material, and I found a letter for when Ed Koch had just been elected to Congress. And it was a letter to my father from Ed Koch saying how wonderful my father was and thanking him for all his support.
Oh my goodness.
And I just got a chuckle up over that. But my father was born down in North Carolina and came up in the late 1950s to New York. Met my mother in the 1960s. My father was a community activist. He helped everybody he possibly could. He was deputy borough president of Manhattan. He was commissioner of the Garment District, commissioner of urban renewal in Harlem. He was secretary of Cooper Square renewal. And he always wanted to make life better for people. And with my mother at his side, they both worked to do whatever they can. They always talked about their wedding day. There was a woman around the corner from where they lived who was being evicted. And they spent part of their wedding day and part of their wedding party helping her get her belongings out of her house and protecting them on the street from being stolen.
Always the activist, always helping.
Always.
So that was a great role model for you just by osmosis growing up.
And, they took me everywhere with them, whether it was political campaign rallies or political campaign rallies in our home,
right, or
to protests.
Right.
I remember wearing a sandwich board when I was 3 years old.
I love it. I love it.
Right around the corner from our house. I don't remember what we were protesting. But, they had me out there. But they took me everywhere with them. And when they didn't, I was always very upset because I wanted to be with them.
I like it. Okay.
And it was very much a part of my life being around them and being around wherever they were, whether it was a political rally, whether it was a fundraiser, whether it was a dinner party. There was a woman named Carol Houseman who was basically the grande dame of New York City Democratic politics. And she had this amazing apartment on Central Park South. She actually owned the entire building.
Okay.
And if you were an up-and-comer in New York City Democratic politics, she would basically throw you a coming out party, so to speak.
Right.
If you were throwing a coming out party by Carol Houseman, it basically meant that you had arrived in New York City Democratic politics. Well, I mean, I remember as a child being at her home and, maybe 5 years old, 6 years old. And while my father would be doing business, drinking scotch and smoking cigars, I'd be running under the pool table with her grandchildren.
Interesting. Interesting.
And then, New Year's Day was always over there and all you would eat was omelets.
Okay.
No idea why, but that's all she served. But everyone from governors to mayors to congresspeople to senators would be there. And these were just the people that were the everyday people that were in my life. These are the people that I still know today.
That's wonderful. So you were immersed in that. And even obviously, in addition to your mother, so you were not only surrounded by a people that found their voice and your parents encouraged you to find your voice and use your voice from 3 wearing a sandwich board. You also had female role models. It sounds like, whether you wanted it or not, that were showing you what it was like even back then, how to be a strong woman and make something happen.
Absolutely. And, that stems from even the person that I'm named after. So, my father was a community activist. One of the first sit-ins that he ever led was to the first woman that was named to the Board of Estimate, which was a woman named Elinor Guggenheimer. And he was trying to fight for low-income housing. And Elinor was named to the Board of Estimate. So we decided, okay, she's a woman. She's probably going to be the one that's going to be most apt to listen to us when it comes to low-income housing, especially for women and for children. So he led a protest of mostly women and children into her office, and he sat in on them. On her office. And she was so excited that people were actually paying attention to her that she sat in on them. And she actually brought in food for the women and the children and everybody that was there. And she and my father became fast friends. And it was a lifelong friendship. And she actually became my godmother. Great. And I am named after her.
Great story.
And Ellie, as she was called, spelled E-L-L-Y, and that's why my nickname is Ellie, spelled E-L-L-Y, was the founder of the New York Women's Agenda, the Women's Forum, and so many other phenomenal women's organizations. She headed up the Commission for Seniors and the Commission for Youth in New York City as well.
Right.
So from a very young age, I was, kind of destined to stand up for those that couldn't speak for themselves. Absolutely. By just the name alone.
Right.
And she died, I think, when she was over 95 years old.
Oh my goodness. Long life.
So that was one of the first women in my life, besides my mother, that was really someone that stood up. And that was my father that kind of made that introduction for me. But when I was about 3, when my father was on the Board of Estimate himself, I was in a meeting with him, and it was somewhere in City Hall, and all I can remember was a paneled office, a wood paneled office, probably similar to this, but much, much bigger and much grander, and a huge wood table with those big round chairs with the copper dots around the studs are all around it. And I'm tiny in this big chair, and all the men were all men. Okay. Right, no women at all, except for me, the little girl. All the men were smoking cigars, as you could do in any office at that time. Right. And they were all talking, and I was listening intently. And I started tugging at my dad's jacket sleeve. And I said, Daddy, what if they did this? And my dad halted the conversation. And he said, "Excuse me, gentlemen, my daughter has something to say." And
you had an audience at a young age.
And I said, "Okay, honey, tell them what you have to say." Now, I have no idea what I said.
Right.
Absolutely no clue. But he wanted me to use my voice. And he taught me that my voice was important.
Oh, Well, that's very powerful. So what would you tell a young girl watching this today, or any woman watching this today, maybe that isn't really used to using their voice or wants to use their voice, but they don't have the courage or they don't know how? Do you have any advice that you would give someone going forward?
Well, I think the biggest problem is there's so many people that tell you that you shouldn't.
Mm.
There's so many men that will try to cut you off. When you start to say something, they'll just shut you up. And it has nothing to do with you not wanting to or not having the courage. It's just the fact that you get used to being cut off. And so it's almost that you get silenced by getting used to being silenced. And so I think you have to just take ownership of your voice and be cognizant of the fact that you're being silenced. And so when you want to say something, you just have to say it and don't let people stop you. And so if you catch somebody trying to stop you from saying something, call them out on it.
Okay.
In this time of Me Too, it's time to say, it's my turn.
Right. And there is a fine line between stepping into your voice and maybe stepping over your voice. By that, I mean, how can you further encourage or guide or advise someone to use their voice and to not be silenced? But there is a powerful way and an impactful way, and maybe there's a way that will just get everyone to tune you out. Any comment on that?
Well, I mean, you don't want to stand up on the table and yell and scream.
Right.
But when you're in the middle of a conversation, you can look at somebody and say, I would like to say something too. May I please speak?
Good advice. Good advice.
And sometimes you do just have to overtalk somebody because a man will do it. And sometimes it's just a matter of continuing to speak, even though somebody else is speaking, because eventually someone else will stop speaking. I've had to do it.
Okay. And it works.
Sometimes. And sometimes it won't. But if you let people walk over you and talk over you, they'll just expect to continue to do that. And you can't let people continuously interrupt you, because then they will continuously interrupt you. And you have to make sure that people understand that they can't do that. And, you know, so in some situations, it may not be appropriate. So, for instance, if you were out with a colleague and some clients, you may not want to do that in front of a client.
Right.
But you're going to want to talk to your colleague afterwards and say something to your colleague.
Right. And
saying that was inappropriate. You didn't let me speak. That can't happen the next time. If it does, I'm going to HR. You know, being a woman in the newspaper business, I don't really think helped or hindered as much as being a very young woman coming into the business. Because I became publisher at age 28.
You were the youngest female publisher.
At the time.
At the time, you were.
I was. And so being young, female, and Black, now that triumvirate, that was problematic.
Right.
Because people really didn't want to pay attention to a young female 28-year-old.
Did that make you want to be heard even more? Did that help you? Did you use that energy and push forward?
I had a lot of energy. And so when people, you know, I don't let people not listen to me.
Right.
So I mean, I was heard. That really wasn't
an issue.
But it really wasn't a possibility of them not hearing me, because it just wasn't going to let that happen. So I was successful in what I needed to do. But it did pose its challenges. You know, as I progressed through this building and working in the different departments and coming up through the ranks. I watched as former editors, had different focuses of the paper. So when I got here, there was a lot of focus on the social aspects of our community, and not really, as much the hard-hitting news and the things that were really affecting the community that needed to be addressed that had been in the past. And, I think we really got back to that over the years. And we try to continue to do that. But I think for a while we really had lost that, and we were really focusing more on the social aspect and not really on the community aspect, in the sense of what was going on in the community, except for on the social scenes.
Right. Do your readers feel that impact? I'm sure that they do. Because
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah. So let's chat a little bit about obstacles. Chime In Project is all about taking obstacles and finding a way to navigate around, under, through, whatever you can do to get around those obstacles. And I know that dyslexia is a big obstacle. Sometimes it is the only obstacle in someone's life, and they don't have great mentors or teachers or parents that kind of help them along and navigate that. Talk to me a little bit about the obstacles. Did you have a teacher, and did you have anyone in your early education that helped you or hindered you? How did that impact your thought process about yourself and basically your process of hope for what you could do and be in the future?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is that there are a lot of people in this world that just suck.
Okay.
They just really suck. I mean, there's some really horrible people in this world. And you've got to figure out who those really horrible people in the world are, and realize that they have no power over you. And that you've got to figure out who the people that are going to support you are, and who are the people that you just have to kind of grin and bear them and move on. That you just kind of have to get through. You have to do what you need to do to pass through them, and then kind of forget about them. That being said, I will tell you about the worst teacher I ever had. Her name was Mrs. Carey. And she was she was 5th or 6th grade. And she was this old, wrinkled, white woman who thought I was just dumb as dirt. Did not understand that I had a learning disability. Just thought I was stupid. And did very little to help me. And just literally called me stupid.
Wow.
Thought I wasn't going to amount to anything, and wrote me off and made me feel horrible about myself.
Wow.
And I couldn't stand her. And I can still picture her in my mind, and I just cringe at the thought of her. And I couldn't wait to get out from under her thumb, because she was just a nasty, evil woman. And so when I graduated from high school, I was walking down the street one day. I was walking down 57th Street. I know exactly where I was, and I just walked out of a diner, and I ran into her. And she saw me, and she's like, "Oh, Ellie, how are you? Did you graduate from high school? Do you have a job? Are you going to trade school?"
Wow.
And I said, "Oh, no, I am going to college. I'm a scholar at St. Lawrence University. Thank you very much." And I walked away. 5 years later, I ran into her again. It was a little bit more than 5 years, because I was already at the Amsterdam News.
Right.
And she saw me, and she said, "Did you graduate from college? Did you get a job? What are you doing?" And this time we were over on First Avenue in the teens. She lived in Stuyvesant Town or Peter Cooper Village. And I said, "Well, actually, I'm an editor at the New York Amsterdam News and doing very well, thank you. What are you doing? And she said, oh, I've retired. And I looked at her and I said, thank God. And I walked away from her, never to be seen again. At this point, she's probably dead.
Right.
But she's, you know, at that point, she was no longer teaching and she was no longer terrorizing young minds. But at that same school, there was another woman. This teacher was named Gloria Kagan. And she was my 5th grade teacher. Mrs. Carey was my 6th grade teacher. And Gloria Kagan was this wonderful woman who didn't understand dyslexia either, but was very kind and tried really, really hard and worked with me as much as she could to do what she could to make sure that I learned.
Right.
And she didn't get it right all the time, but she tried.
Right.
And in 1995, I believe it was, a piece ran on me in the New York Times in the public lives section. And a few weeks later, I got a card in the mail. And it was from Gloria Kagan. And it said, it's so great to see my kids grow up so well.
Love it.
Now, that Gloria Kagan she passed away several years ago, happened to be the mother of Supreme Court Justice Elinor Tatum.
That's great.
And so she did pretty well in growing up her kids.
Yes, she did. Yes, she did.
But it's amazing how 2 women in 2 classrooms right next to each other can have such a different impact on a way a child learns and the way a child looks at learning. Because I can hold on to one as somebody who wanted me to succeed.
Yes.
And one who could care less if I did and did everything they possibly could to instill in me that I was worthless. To have one teacher that did everything in their power to see that I succeed and another that could care less is incredible. And to have parents that believed in me and that supported me so much, that made it very special as well. But not everybody has that kind of support system.
No, they don't.
And so the kind of advice that I give to people in general is that it doesn't necessarily have to be a parent. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a teacher. But you have to find that person or persons that believe in you.
Right.
And that can be your friends. It can be an aunt or an uncle. It can be a teacher. It can be a custodian in the school. It can be a security guard. It can be a friend's parents. But you need to find those people that believe in you, and you need to hold on to those people tight, and you need to let them help you. Because so many times there are people out there that want to help you, and you don't let them in.
Right.
And you don't let them help you.
Right.
But there are people that may not be able to open the door, but they might be able to crack a window. And you take anything you can get, because those little cracks in those windows, you know what? You get a window cracked open, you can get through it, and then you can open the door for yourself.
I love that. I love that. I think of a crowbar when I think of you, because that's one of your sayings when we had a conversation about, if you've got a little bit of an opening, you take a crowbar and you just yank that thing wide open.
Yeah,
I love that. So
absolutely.
you see endless possibilities, and you see absolutely no limitations on someone with dyslexia as I don't. But it is important to know that the people around you can impact you greatly, negatively or positively. So I'm grateful that you had such great positive people in your life.
Well, we think about people that had dyslexia, and they say Einstein had dyslexia.
A lot of
Charles Dickens had dyslexia.
Yeah.
I mean, just to name 2 of them.
Yeah.
I mean, and the world would be a very different place without both of them.
That's right. It's understanding. I know a lot of very successful men and women that have dyslexia, and they outshined everyone around them. So don't stick a label on someone and put them in a corner. That's for sure.
Exactly.
That's for sure. So what's next for you? You're here at the paper. You're doing phenomenal things. What would you like to do next? Is this where you would like to end up? Do you have any other goals that are top of mind? Not that this isn't enough. This is a phenomenal position, a phenomenal platform.
Who knows what's next?
Mm-hmm.
My daughter is 8.
Mm-hmm.
So being a mom is, one of the number one things on my list.
Right.
Which I really enjoy doing.
Right.
I enjoy showing her the world, very much the same way my parents showed it to me.
Mm-hmm.
Doing things like introducing her to Gloria Steinem a few weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
And getting to show her who Gloria Steinem is
Mm-hmm.
and was. Showing her those connections as to who these strong women are that she's meeting. I look at the photographs I have of her with people like Nancy Pelosi and Kirsten Gillibrand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really exciting when she actually understands who these people are now. And that's really important to me. Strong girls and strong young women,
Right.
especially in this day and age. So while the paper is one thing that's extremely important to me, just empowering our young people and helping other people to make a difference. As long as I continue to do that in whatever capacity,
Mm-hmm.
then I think I'm on the right track. And I have no idea what that's going to look like.
Okay.
But I'm going to continue trying to do that in some way, shape, or form. And, hopefully it'll expand beyond the paper. But who knows?
Who knows? Well, you certainly have a phenomenal platform, and you definitely have made a lot of things happen. So I think there's no end in sight for you personally. I perhaps would see you out there on a ballot someday in the future if you ever have a political desire that way. So your daughter, I know that it's important to you to spend time with her. I think you tuck her into bed every night, or that's something that's high on your priority list. What would you say to someone who says, wow, you are phenomenal and what you've done is incredible. I could only hope to attain half of your success. How did you balance having a family and being successful and having responsibility at this level? Was it easy? Was it difficult? How do you balance that?
Well, nothing's ever easy.
Right.
And number one. Number two is I'm divorced.
Mm-hmm.
So I only have her half the time.
Okay.
So I try to make sure that most of my business evening commitments are on days that I don't have her.
Right.
Sometimes that can't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I drag her with me to events. Sometimes she goes willingly.
Right.
Other times not so willingly.
She'll thank you later.
And, sometimes she doesn't want to go, but then ends up having a wonderful time. But there are the times where she is asleep underneath the table. But I think she will remember some of those days fondly. There are a few nights that I'm not home, but I try to be.
Right.
And there are those days that she's extremely mad at me and other days that she's really happy. But, I remember the night that I came home after election night when Hillary Clinton lost. I got home about 2:00 in the morning.
Mm.
And she was in my bed, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and she woke up and she said, "Mommy, who won?" And I said, "Donald Trump."
Mm-hmm.
And she just started crying and she said, "Mommy, I'm scared."
Mm. She's that aware.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the headline for my editorial that week.
Oh, wow.
"Mommy, I'm scared."
Mm.
And so whether she knows it or not, she's very involved in everything that I do.
Right.
And a lot of things that I do are all centered around her. And at the end of the day, for her. Because everything I do is for her.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that I try to do when it comes to making the world a better place is at the end for her. But you can't be a perfect parent. I don't think there's such a thing. Mm-hmm. And there are going to be times you're going to disappoint your kids.
Right.
I do it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
If you ask her, I probably disappoint her more than I make her happy.
You're human.
Exactly.
Human.
Yeah. But they want us to be superhuman.
Right.
And we can't be. And they remember,
mm-hmm.
but they also forget.
Mm-hmm.
But they'll remember when you least want them to remember.
Right.
And they'll forget when you least want them to forget. And they'll remember the things that you don't want them to remember. They'll forget the things you don't want them to forget, which is unfortunate because you can never win.
Right.
But you know that you just got to know that you're doing the best that you can do. And that you know that you're doing it for the best reasons possible. And, I remember I was speaking with a very famous singer once. And she said when she had to leave to go do some sort of event and her son didn't want her to go. And she said to her son, well, do you want lights? Do you want to eat?
Mm.
Do you want your toys?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to live a life that's comfortable? Well, then mommy has to go work.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't want any of these things, then I can just stay here with you.
Mm.
But you can't have any of this stuff
mm-hmm.
if I don't work. So sometimes that works a little bit.
Right.
But, it's a trade-off.
Right.
And sometimes you have to decide what's worth it and what's not.
Right.
And there's some times where I do just stay home with her because there's some things I just don't want to miss.
It's important. Now I'm going to ask you my famous question. What would you tell your 27-year-old self?
Have more fun.
Have more fun. Anything in specific or just lighten up and have more fun in general?
Well, first of all, I would back it up even more.
Okay.
What would I tell my 18-year-old self?
Okay.
What I would tell my 18-year-old self is when I went to college, I would say, take more advantage of where I was at college and do more of the fun things that I could have done when I was in college, like going skiing and going to the lakes and doing things like that, besides studying and doing all that other stuff.
Right.
But my 27-year-old self, I would say have more fun, not at 27,
right?
But as
time progresses.
As time progresses.
Mm-hmm.
And don't forget what fun is.
Mm.
And don't forget what gives you pleasure.
Mm.
And that you need to continue those things throughout your life.
Mm-hmm.
And hold on to those things that give you solace and give you the things that re-energize you.
What would you tell your future self, if you were 18 or 27, to not worry about or don't waste time on?
Don't waste time on the people that don't matter.
Okay.
Those people that you cannot change, that are just going to be those evil people like Mrs. Carey, that you just have to get through.
Right.
And you can't do anything about, but just get past them.
Right.
And worry about the people that do matter. And focus on them and spend your time on them.
Good advice. Good advice. Do you still like writing?
Writing?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you ever find yourself writing things that aren't surrounded by activism or a movement or anything political? Do you ever write fiction? Do you ever have dreams of writing a novel?
Every once in a while. I had a friend who had this story that she told me about a half wolf dog that she had in her 20s. Mm-hmm. And I'd written a short story about that and some other little things, but not often, more, creative nonfiction type things.
I like it. Well, it's been a pleasure interviewing today, and I thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you for coming to visit me.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Mentors and Moguls podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, rate and review this interview and share it with a friend who could benefit from today's guest. You can find bonus video episodes at mentorsandmogulspodcast.com or check out our events page and our blog at heatherrstone.com. Until next time, make it a great day.